joining us after we do our breathing exercises.
Thank you, Mitzy. Now just join me in taking a few deep breaths in through your nose and out through your mouth. Again, in deep, inhale and out. In and out. And as you take this other inhale, think about all the great things that happened today and feel the emotions attached to those good things and let go of the things that didn't serve you. Again, in and out. Last breath in and let go of the things to do for the remainder of the day. Just be present with us for the next 30 minutes as we delve into a deep discourse with our guest, Chris Paprotny. And Chris is a mind architect and forensic mind reconstructor. His expertise isn't in topics, but in transformation itself. Using a unique blend of neuroscience and somatic practices, he decodes the subconscious patterns that keep high achievers solving the same problems on repeat. Chris's work isn't about fixing issues. It's about engineering a new mental framework from the inside out, making old limitations completely obsolete. Let's welcome Chris.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Is there anything you would like to add to that bio?
No, I think that kind of sums it up. So obviously we can go into more details as we go through, but I like it.
I just have to say that I was noticing that your website, physicalfitness.com, that is one good website.
So the site itself is actually kind of under redesign. So obviously a lot of it is part fitness, but it's part therapy. So that was kind of an initial phase that I was at a little while ago, and I've kind of migrated now into more mind architecture rather than sort of specific areas. So
But the
based on
domain
that,
name itself is just
yeah,
so.
yeah. So I'll give you actually a bit of detail as the domain name. So physical finesse is actually a acronym for the 8 holistic principles. So you've got physical, financial, intellectual, nutritional, emotional, spiritual, social, and environmental. So I basically took all of those and then created the actual brand name based on obviously physical being separate, and then obviously the rest of them being the rest of the finesse acronym. So there's a bit of background for you.
Wow. Wow. What a great way to start. Now, I was impressed with the mind architect and the forensic mind reconstructor.
Yep.
This particular or these titles for me they're huge, and it offers big promises. So I just want to dive so deep into that, because when I read it and I read your bio and I saw how you were able to, if I can use the word, marry advanced informed trauma therapy, coaching, somatic integration, and attachment theory into your practice, I'm impressed, and I'm ready for the journey, for you to take us on that journey. Where did it begin? What's the genesis?
So for me, it started back in 2016. So what happened was I got to a point in my life where I'd been running sort of habits, patterns, behaviors, and everything to the point of basically hitting burnout. And I hit burnout, I think it was around October 2016. And basically, my body practically gave way. So my spine and my lower back basically decided that a right angle, so 90 degrees, was optimal. So I then had a physical structure breakdown, but it was symbolic of more of the macro concept, which is obviously you as the individual and all of your subsequent structures. And obviously, with the spine being the pillar and the spine being obviously the formation of that structure, that was the first thing that ultimately went, well, hold on, we can't sustain this way of being anymore. So what then happened is I started going into like chiropractic resolution for obviously rebalancing and realigning, and obviously the muscle groups and everything else coming to and from that. And then I started going down the route of, well, hold on, there's something not quite right. But obviously, all of the doctors and everybody else that I was sort of seeing couldn't pinpoint it. So I then got inquisitive and started going down sort of the spirituality route. I started going down all of the, well, hold on, what information have I got available to me in terms of stories, in terms of ways of doing things that were no longer consistent with that kind of identity, as it were. And then that started a spiral of events over the next 2 to 3 years. And then there was a potential break. And then it restarted back in 2020. And then I've been on another sort of 5, 6 year cycle since that period. So if you want to go into any of the major sort of talking points throughout that period, then let me know. I can highlight some of the highlights themselves. But that's kind of the overall sort of everything started to break down. So the depersonalization, the derealization. And then it was a case of, well, actually, beyond all these identities and structures, who am I as an individual? And then what I worked out is how we take a lot of the concepts and we put things together, but we don't necessarily have a taught way of putting them together. So one of my methodologies that obviously underpins the kind of overall concept of physical finesse is the disjointed learning theory method. And what that does is it pulls through a lot of disconnected areas, which you obviously highlighted earlier in terms of the neuroscience, in terms of all the other practicalities. And what it does is it makes the individual elements a whole element. So whereas you wouldn't expect them to fit together, they actually fit together too perfectly once you know enough about everything. And what I found is that I can take that concept and I can expand it out, but then I can also take a simple concept and make it really complex, and then reverse engineer it to make it simple. And what then happens is the individual then comes in, which is why we're transformation and not topics, because it doesn't matter what you come to me with. It could be relationships, health, wealth, it could be narcissistic sort of tendencies that you're accustomed to, patterns, habits, and behaviors around that type of structure. And basically, what we do is we go, well, what are the stories? What are the emotional connections? What language are we using? And what are we sort of basically showing up as in terms of a misalignment from who we are to who we're actually meant to be? And then that's built into further structures around spiritual, mental, emotional, and physical elements that are then subsequently decommissioned and broken down and demolished, as it were, to then get you back to, well, hold on, who do you as the individual wish to be and show up as? If you were parenting yourself and you were making your own decisions rather than all of the voices in your head and all of the education that you've received from people, places, and things around you that have formed who you are to date, but then that subsequently creates a gap and a misalignment. So hopefully that gives you a bit of structure around it.
Great, great place to start. I love when I read your bio where you said you fix problems, which you just touch on a little, and you make them irrelevant.
Mhm.
Can you break down for us what's the difference between fixing a problem and making it relevant? Making it irrelevant, sorry.
Yep. So when we fix a problem, you basically put a band-aid over the issue. So that could be a coping mechanism, that could be a survival adaptation. So what we have is we have an indirect way of moving forward from a place of functioning, but ultimately it becomes a place of dysfunction. So what we're saying is that when it becomes irrelevant, it means that we've actually ripped the band-aid off. We've seen what's ultimately under there from all of the four planes, which is the mental, the spiritual, the emotional, and the physical. And then ultimately, what that leaves you with is a blank canvas that you, as the individual, can then create from. So, what we're doing in terms of making it irrelevant is we're going, actually, what is the lesson that needs to be taken from it so that it doesn't keep repeating? It's not patterns, it's not habits, it's not behaviors, it's not coping mechanisms, it's not survival adaptations. And what it does is it gives us the C between the B and the D. So, what I mean by that is B is birth, D is death. The C is the choices that you make between the two of them. So what we have is we have actually, I'm not doing this because I was told to do it. I'm not doing this because it's just what I've always done. I've actually seen that there is a lesson to take here for my own personal growth and development. And what I'm doing is I'm giving myself the freedom in order to then make choices. And that gives me the free will aspect that I've been missing because I've just been running all these patterns in the background. So ultimately, when we make it irrelevant, it comes from a place of just not running our lives on autopilot, as in the subconscious programming. And what we can do is we can show up consciously, which is ultimately 5% of our general day to day. And then we can use that 5% to reprogram the 95%. And then by default, that 95% becomes 100% of who we are because the 95% has been consciously educated and the 5% is consciously educating, which then gives us a complete wholeness rather than the separation, which is what mum and dad said I should do, what the teachers told me I should do, how I should act and behave based on all of my subconscious programming from the past. So hopefully that
Thank
sums it
you.
up.
Thank you. um, can you elaborate a little on the 95% educating? You said, did you, and the 5%, what word did you
Yep.
use? Yeah.
So it's so what we have to do is we're 100% whole and complete ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
However, we run two distinct kind of setups. One of them is repeat actions that we don't need to focus on. So if you're old enough to drive, once you've learnt to drive, you just show up, you go in the car and you're on autopilot basically. And that's what we mean by the 95% subconscious. And then we have the I'm learning to drive part, which is the 5% conscious, because you haven't yet acknowledged that, hold on, I need to put the clutch down, then put it into first gear, then lift the clutch up, and then take the handbrake off, and then etc. etc. So we have the two distinctions between one is active and one is more passive, but just ongoing in the background. And that's kind of what I mean by the conscious educates the subconscious, but the subconscious has previously been educated. And then that's then where we get the tipping point between, well, hold on, how much of the subconscious is what we've told ourselves that we are, and how much is what everybody else told us we should be? And then that's the distinction between the two. So we're constantly feeding the conscious into the subconscious. However, the structure that facilitates it all behind has actually closed off at the age of 7. So if we look at the subconscious from a place of up to the age of 7, you're basically like a sponge. So you assume, and you have to assume, that everything you're told is true and accurate, because otherwise it makes you unsafe or it makes your external environment unsafe. So we have to assume that everything is 100% accurate. However, after 7, you actually get the conscious thinking part of the brain, which kicks in. So now you can start interacting more with the environment based on the information that you've got from 0 to 7. So then you're starting to go into, well, actually, how accurate and relevant is all that 0 to 7 information and all those experiences and how I deal with them and where I was supported or unsupported, where I felt that my needs were met, where they weren't met. And then ultimately we have now this, what I call a security guard or gatekeeper, which is then guarding everything that you've been told is true up to the age of 7. And then what happens is you now can't allow new information in if it contradicts with anything that you've learned from 0 to 7. It becomes very difficult unless it passes through repetition and exposure. And what we have to do is expose and repeat to then reprogram it, which then obviously comes back to the 5% to the 95%. So it takes a while to then amass enough of a exposure and repetition to then override what was previously in there. So that should hopefully get us to where we need to be.
I am a client and I come to you and I have this belief system that I'm not good enough. And it shows up as self-sabotage. And I don't like this phrase that I'm about to use, but I'm going to use it anyhow. It shows up as the imposter syndrome. How do you work with me?
So we need the story. So as much as we can apply all of these labels, they are literally that. They're just a way of the mind conceptualizing something that we don't fully understand. But the problem with doing that is who's told you then what those labels actually mean and how are you then applying them? Because what I need to know is, well, underlying, we're not feeling good enough. We're not feeling worthy. We're not feeling as though we're fulfilled and we are just enough in general. So in order for that to happen, there has to be an outside influence. So I'm not looking at the labels, I'm looking at the language forensics, which is my more unique positioning. I'm looking at, well, hold on, how have you constructed the story? And ultimately, what I need to find out is when you have a look at how we construct things, you have a yes or a no. You have a this is positive and this is negative. However, this will never get you out of a situation because you have hybridization of both. And what happens is when you have the subconscious kick in and go, well, hold on, I'm not good enough. This is running on autopilot. So everything you do will show up in that way, and you'll find with the reticular activating system, everything that makes that statement true. But then what we don't do is we don't have enough to disprove it because ultimately we're not looking to disprove it. So what we do is we get more of the thing that we don't want. And then what we have to do is we have to go, well, hold on, where are the things that disprove it? And that's our starting point. Because what we want to do is go, well, where is it wrong? Because this is going to give us the story. Because as soon as I go, well, hold on, if you don't feel enough, then what are you doing currently that makes you not feel enough? Right? Because in this present moment, and if we're grounded and we've done our breath work and our somatics and we're nice and calm and we're focused on whatever the task is that we're in, generally speaking, you don't have a problem. You're not sitting here going, am I enough to show up on this podcast, for instance? Am I worthy enough to be sat here? You're going, well, hold on, I'm just being. So I'm in my element, I'm in my spiritual essence and my flow. So where does that story then kick in? Because what we're then going to do is go, well, hold on, let's disprove it. So if you're not feeling enough, but you're enough for where you are now, then what are the constructs that mean that you go, well, hold on, if I accept that statement as I am enough is true, where does my mind then go from that place? Because it's going to go, no, it's wrong, it's false because of X, Y, and Z. And usually what we do is we brush them off, which is the self-sabotage element that you were highlighting and talking about. Because what there is there's this alternate person that is fighting underneath all of this conditioning, going, well, hold on, this is not who I am, which is then where the imposter syndrome comes in. Because we associate with the labels, we associate with something that we don't fully understand. However, we have to reverse engineer that, because the thing that we don't fully understand is actually ourselves. And then we have to disconnect from the thing that we think we are in order to then go back to the thing that we're not yet, that we haven't yet associated with. So as you can see, it gets tricky because you're kind of doing cartwheels and backflips over different ways of wording things. But then when you go down the actual rabbit hole, this could link to any number of things. And I mean, in my past experiences, I've had people that have met partners in university. They've developed PCOS, endometriosis, not had a clue what it is, not expected to then be able to have children, gone on to then marry that person and partner, to then not still be able to have children because the partner created an energetic imbalance, which created the PCOS. Then you have to go back all the way through that to then work out that they actually have a misdemeanor in a past lifetime, which then becomes a karmic imbalance, which then needs to be corrected, which is then showing up in this lifetime for rebalancing. And then I worked with this lady, and we went back to, like, I think it was 1840s in Louisiana. And basically her now husband had killed her daughter in a field while she was sleeping. So what happens is the two of them, between them, have to exchange and rebalance the giving and taking of life. But what she was doing in this lifetime is when they met, her body naturally put up a defense system in order to protect the daughter from the past lifetime by not bringing her back into this lifetime. So we had to go through, do hypnotherapy, work out the stories, work out the patterns and behaviors that were associated with it, so that her and her husband could have the child in this lifetime, to then rebalance the karma from the past lifetime, and then literally make that situation subsequently irrelevant because of that balance point. So that's one example, but there's a couple of hundred.
I heard you included some constellation. Is that a part of your therapeutic approach?
So as I sort of adhered to earlier, I use anything and everything that the individual brings to the table. So if they're into something specific or they have a certain pattern, this is why I work in transformation, not topics. Because if I'm going, well, hold on, I work in topics, well, what topic would you classify that as? Because it means that I'm not going to potentially work with that person, because they're not going to go, oh, it's a relationship problem. They're not necessarily going to know it's a karmic imbalance. They're not going to necessarily know anything about past lives, because maybe their viewpoint up to this date is only current lifetime. But once you then start going, well, actually, how do we work with people for transformation? You're going, what is this individual coming to me with? And how do we nail it so it becomes irrelevant and they can move on with their life from a different energy? They can create differently, they can show up differently, they can have different experiences, because we've gone, hold on, we've balanced everything and we've taken the lessons and the learning for our own spiritual growth to then subsequently move forward with. And that's the distinguishing factor that I played around with for years. It's like, well, what am I actually meant to be doing? Because I work with people, but you can literally basically come up with anything and I can help you work through it, because all I'm doing is getting an understanding of you better than you understand yourself. And then from that place and with my extended skill set, I can go, well, this is what we're doing and this is where we want to be. And how do I get you from one to the other? Not through coping, not through surviving, through literally what are the lessons, the learning and the development. And then how do we instill all of those qualities back rather than having them fragmented and spread across time.
As I listen to you, Chris, I'm hearing a lot of personal transformation that occurred along with whatever training and skill set. But you, in the beginning, you told us about the physical experience that you had that began your transformational journey. After that physical episode, how did the emotional, mental, spiritual transformation began for you?
I love that question because it dovetails nicely into obviously what we highlighted earlier that you were going to expand on. So once I'd got through the physical element, obviously I had to start working on the emotional element side of things. And one of the things I used to say to myself was that I'm really healthy, and obviously my health is valued and of huge importance to me. So then what happened was obviously I got married and then had kids, and my eldest child actually had a syndrome called Stickler syndrome. And what it worked out to be is that it was linked to myself, but obviously I'd gone literally all my life up to that point without even knowing. So he was obviously brought into this life to show me that obviously this element of me needs re sort of connecting. And that was where the emotional side started to kick in because I literally went from I'm fit and I'm healthy and everything's fine to, oh, maybe I'm not as healthy as I thought I was. And that started a chain of events that was, well, hold on, I'm broken, I'm damaged. All of the subconscious sort of patterning that was consistent with, hold on, everything's fine, was now actually what happens if I don't make it beyond a certain amount of time? What happens if I literally fall apart? What happens if kind of each of the individual circumstances then causes further issues? So to give you a bit of detail, like one of the things is retinal detachment. And I've had a persistent fear of having my eyes operated on for I don't know how long. But literally, I then had to have my retina in both eyes glued, so through cryotherapy. And that was part of the emotional release. It was getting to the stage where I was able to actually face that. But having done all of my own past work, I had been punished and tortured for all of these witchcrafty kind of wizardry, magicy, or black magically rather, stuff from past lives. And all of this stuff was coming up because I think in one past life I was literally cut open and left to bleed to death. So obviously one of the things was obviously having my eyes taken out. And it's a what if I can't see? So I had to grasp all of these non-logical elements and then subsequently go through and make sense of it all through sort of little fragments and little pieces of information that I was being given and came across. And it literally got to the point where I was building my emotional intelligence, but I was also having to get rid of all of these kind of cellular memories that were stored in the body, but they were linked through the emotional side, whereby there was unprocessed trauma. And these were coming up, and then subsequently I had to split from obviously my wife at the time, and then obviously the elder boys, and that destroyed me further because it was a case of, well, hold on, my identity was built around being a father. Who am I when I'm not looking after everybody, when I'm not showing up every day, when I'm not providing, when I'm not supporting? And that was the secondary sort of twist in the tale. So that was kind of one of the main grappling points between the emotional side, but obviously the emotional side links the mental side to the physical. So then I had to start going, well, hold on, what are these stories that I'm then telling myself? Who am I now beyond, hold on, this is my role as a father? Because who is Chris as the individual? Away from all of these traumas, away from all of these kind of discrepancies, these imbalances, all of these stories that basically show up in my day-to-day life and how I approach things that ultimately aren't consistent with who I am as the individual. So it took me quite a while to get to grips with, well, who is this person? And then what I found is the more that I got to grips with it, the more I was able to go off in the other direction. So you can kind of think of it like a tree. When you plant the seed originally, it grows in both directions. So it grows up in order to get to the sunlight, but it also grows down in order to reroot itself, basically. So it was kind of that energetic push-pull and that tearing apart of identities and structures that then was growing both ways. And it basically, the drained kind of showing up and the burnout were all kicking in. And even at one point, it got to the point where I was literally a drive away from ending my life. And this is not that I was going to do it, but it was a metaphorical sense of death of an identity. And what I actually worked out is that because if I drove out from my hometown, there's actually a cemetery where my brother, who passed away at the age of 3, was buried. So I was 5 at the time. And what happened was ultimately I was driving and I then stopped off at the graveyard or the cemetery, right? And it was at that point that it started to then make sense. So it was the metaphorical death of the identity, which actually started to occur at age 5. And then this is then where it all started to kick in, because I went back to the whole, well, actually, I've gone to see him, obviously where he's laid to rest. And I started then going and having all of these mental thoughts and structures that were like, well, hold on, that connects to that. And that's a metaphorical death of some identity, not a physical death of an identity. Then you have the whole, well, actually, it started at the age of 5. So at what point at the age of 5 did I then lose my connection to self? And what it was is after he passed, I actually had a sensation. I was about half a mile away, I think it was, and I had a sensation that something wasn't quite right. And this is where my energetic connection and my healing abilities had come into kind of force. So I was picking up on something that wasn't quite right, but at the age of 5, there's only so much you can do about it because you don't fully understand it. And I rushed back, and then obviously he was being sick, and then eventually had a stomach ulcer blow up, and the doctors missed it. And because of that structure, there was part like survivor guilt at the time, but then once again, that's a loss of an identity. And then also in the same breath, I saw him because if I look at some of my skill sets now, I can sense energies and spiritual elements and kind of more mediumship type stuff. And basically at the time, I said to somebody, I think it was my mum at the time, that I can actually see obviously my brother in the window. And she's like, yeah, but he's obviously passed away. But I was adamant that I could see him in the window. And then I think because that was shut down at that point, and rightly so, because I didn't have the support or the networks to then go, well, actually, there's more out there than meets the eye. And then literally at the age of 5 was the tipping point for, well, actually, I've shut off all of my spiritual gifts. I've shut off everything else, and I just became a shadow of my former self. So rather than the remembrance and the growth and the development, it got closed off. And then subsequently, it was reactivated later on for me to then start this part of the process when I could then parent myself and then I could become the person I was meant to be without necessarily having mentors, having leaders that were going to show me the way or having to invest in things outside of myself. And then that's basically the culmination of where physical finesse came from and why I do currently what I do, because I can walk people through these experiences. I can understand exactly where they have disconnects. I can work out why things aren't the way they are and what their greater lessons are, whether they've got soul plans and development that is associated with it, whether it's karmic ties. And as you can tell, the list is pretty much endless. And then once again, it comes back to how can I do that in just a topic? But yeah, I can do it in transformation.
So when you're working with a person, how do you lead them through this process and what, and I don't know if this is such a thing, but is there like a typical time frame that it takes or certain steps that each person has to do to get through this? Can you kind of elaborate on, like, if I came to you as a client and I said, okay, I know I'm stuck, I don't know why, how would you, what process would you take me through to help me get to where you have gotten?
Yep. So there's a thing called divine time, and I adhere by it. So what this is it basically leaves it up to the individual to work through at their own pace. So what we're doing is we're going to the point where we're constantly pushing the boundaries. So what that looks like is somebody shows up and they've got a problem. However, they don't know what the problem is. So the first port of call is to actually find out what the problem is. And then we have to work out, well, what are you able to expose yourself to? Is it a general conversation? Is it hypnotherapy because you've literally blocked everything down? And so we need to start unraveling little bits of information. And then what happens is we have to get to the point where we break out of that initial element that is the restriction and the guardedness and the control, because that is going to stop everything that goes beyond it. So that's the first thing that needs to be broken, not necessarily fixing or approaching the actual issue that they have in the first place. Because ultimately, at some point, there's going to be a dark night of the soul and there's going to be an identity crisis. And a lot of people are not going to be in a position to deal with either of those two, because it's literally going to present everything in one big go to basically test whether or not you're serious. So as much as somebody can show up, the question is how much of their testing and their preparation work has already been done to that point. And the only way you can really gauge that is by having the conversation around knowing exactly where they are. Because what we don't want to do is we don't want to basically push them off the cliff if they can't yet fly. So they have to at least know that they have to flap their wings on the way down. Otherwise, we've got a problem, because they're either at the point where they're ready and getting presented with the opportunity and then turning it down, or they're going to be ready because they're presented the opportunity and then they're going to run with it. And it's why I can't really answer your question directly, because ultimately the individual is going to show up as they are, and the whole point is authenticity. So what we don't want to do is, yeah, I've got ego and I'm showing up, and yeah, I want to get this done, and then to realize, like, after day one that, hold on, it's a no-go. So in order to try and answer your question, it's a case of the individual will run their own program. However, there are shortcuts. So you can get the programming from somebody, as in, this is what happens if it's true. This is what happens if it's not true. And if somebody finds out that the not true is true and the true is not true, then there's a hybridization. And the hybridization will always allow me to come up with a response and ignore the original problem. And then that's the key as to what we're looking for. Because the biggest thing that I've found is the moment I work out the program and I can see the full program, it opens up the space for the individual to walk into. So I'm now not playing around with the, are you ready? Are you not ready? Because energetically, I now have a door open in metaphorical terms for somebody to walk through, because I can see it. So if I can see it, I can show you it. Whereas before, you can't see it or aren't ready to see it, and I don't know what you're not ready to see. So therefore, that door is well and truly closed.
Wow. Wow, there's so much to unpack. But what I heard, and you give me the same answer when I use myself as an example, is that your approach is not a cookie cutter. You don't have a cookie cutter approach. You meet the client or the person where they are and become the guide. But you use two terms that I would like you to explain for our listeners who might not know what a karmic tie is and what is divine time.
Yep. So a karmic tie, in simple linear terms, is where you have what's known as cause and effect. So we work in the 3D, which has polarity. So north, south, east, west, up, down, left, right, that type of structure. So what you have is, for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. However, the karmic tie happens when there is an imbalance created in that cause and in that effect. So what happens is somebody does something either for their own personal gain and benefit or at the expense of somebody else. So those two things are opposites in terms of the application of the person, but they create the same outcome, which is why we have a problem, because you can do two opposing actions and still create the problem. So too little of something is just as bad as too much of something.
Mm.
So what we have is we then have an imbalance between what should have happened and what actually happened. And that creates the karmic tie, because neither of those parties, and you only need two, and obviously it can kind of multiply out to multiples based on if you've got a group of people all in the same kind of cycle or environment. And what that means is that those two people have to ultimately come back together in order to rebalance it. So as I gave with the example earlier, if you take a life in the past life, you come back this life and you have to give the life, or you have to give a form of life, or you have to repay that karmic debt, as it were. And then because we're then looking at that imbalance, then that's where the karmic is, because it is literally cause and effect, or causing an effect that's not balanced.
And what is divine time?
So divine time is basically where you lose all sense of control over everything and you trust the process. Because there is one key element. With divine time, you have to trust the process, but you are the process. So there's no disconnection and there's no separation. It's not like I get up and I go, well, hold on, have I set my alarm clock the night before and will it go off? Because if I trust that I always set my alarm clock, I don't need to check if the alarm clock goes off. I know it's going to happen. So it's kind of like faith, I assume would be like the term. So hope is taking a step without knowing the steps there. Faith is taking the step knowing that something's going to be there. And what we're doing is we're getting to the position whereby we can trust the process, i.e. ourselves, away from the trauma, away from the conditioning, away from the patterns, habits, and behaviors, away from the self-domestication, away from the original domestication, and everything becomes irrelevant. And the moment everything becomes irrelevant is the moment the process runs and functions and operates, because now there's a lack of interference in that process. And then we have what's known as alignment. And then that creates a whole nother concept, which is, what frequency are you putting out? How much healing have you done? What experiences are you attracting rather than chasing? And then once again, the trusting of the process becomes, how much work do you do on yourself in order to find out who you were meant to be, which is the ultimate purpose in life.
There's a lot there. We're gonna have to go back and listen to this several times because it's a lot of new and complex terminology and process that you've described, and sort of, I'm sure for a lot of our listeners as well as myself, a lot of it's the first time we're hearing a lot of those
Yep.
types of concepts. Before we get into our wrap up with Sharmin's rapid fire questions, how can people get in touch with you? What is the best way to find you and reach you?
So the easiest way is the website, which is currently going under construction. So will be renewed. I think it's in a couple of days' time, but it's going to have a whole new look to it. But that's www.physicalfinesse.com. And that should obviously give you contact pages. Alternatively, you can find me on TikTok, you can find me on Instagram, you can find me on YouTube under Physical Finesse. And there's plenty of content from relationships to spirituality to anything and everything. So the idea behind it is the garden is there. So if you're looking for resources, then obviously trusting the process, you'll come across exactly what you need at whatever time it is that you come across it. So it's already set up, but they're the key elements.
Excellent. And rapid fire, Sharmin.
So this is our fun part, rapid fire questions.
Yep.
You're working in one word.
Okay.
So what you do in one word.
Transformation.
Coffee or tea?
Neither.
The
Hot
biggest
chocolate.
the biggest myth about transformation.
The biggest what? Transformation?
Myth.
Oh, it's difficult. Or difficult.
You don't fix problems, you make them
Irrelevant.
the most common nervous system whisper you hear.
Scared.
Mm.